It's great to welcome back to the program today Richard Wolff, who is, of course, Professor Emeritus of Economics at my undergraduate alma mater, the University of Massachusetts, currently a visiting professor at the New School University in New York City. The latest book, called Understanding Marxism, is available all of the normal places, including in digital form. Professor Wolff, great to have you on again.
Glad to be here, David. Really am.
So let's start digging into some of the ideas that we are seeing put forward by the 2020 Democratic challengers. On the one hand, we've sort of seen the mainstreaming of some ideas that even as recently as 4 years ago were considered relatively niche and left, including a wealth tax, including Medicare for all in a sort of more serious and particular way. What's your overall sense of this shift? And do you think that there is any policy in particular that goes far enough in terms of the type of systemic change that may be needed? Or are we really still talking about sort of band-aids and fixing things around the edges?
Well, I basically think, to get to the core of your question, that we are still seeing the vast preponderance of proposals from the Democratic contenders. Those are band-aids. That's right. Those are the attempt to see honestly, and certainly better than the Republicans can manage, what the failures and flaws and problems of our economic and political system are. But I do think it's still early in the process of facing up to all of it, so that they are mostly band-aids. They are mostly attempts to take what we already have some of and make it more comprehensive, make it more generous, and hope against hope, really, that these adjustments will somehow be adequate. What I do find remarkable, and I see it in the shifting over to Medicare for all and taxing the wealth, there is the beginning of an understanding that these band-aids have to go further than one used to think band-aids had to go. That it wasn't just a little tweaking of the tax rates and so forth, but something as fundamental as imposing a tax on wealth itself in the form of stocks and bonds, which this country has avoided doing for most of its history. So it is a recognition that we need more, and yet a hope that relatively modest things will be sufficient to what? To change what's going on. I think that's the really interesting thing, that capitalism in America has now produced such an extreme level of inequality, such an extreme experience of capitalism's instability, the crash of 2008, the 10 years we've just lost trying, quote unquote, to recover from it, the fact that the entire financial community knows that either this year or next year we're going to have a recession, and who knows how bad this one will be. All of this roiling of the realities we live in is pushing our politics on the right over toward Mr. Trump and all that he represents, but on the left in the directions that your question raises.
I saw a critique of that you were involved in some way, shape, or form. I forget exactly on what show, related to the idea of universal basic income, sort of in the mode that Andrew Yang has been proposing it. And I've talked about this a lot, including with him, and I have some problems with the particulars. But to sort of paraphrase, and I hope I'm doing it correctly, one of your more general criticisms was that giving people $1,000 a month is not going to solve a lot of the structural issues that exist regarding inequality, regarding the relationship between most workers and their employers, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought that that was a good critique, but I wondered, couldn't the same opposition be cited against food stamps, against WIC, et cetera, et cetera? And it doesn't strike me as a reason not to do it, as long as we sort of recognize its limitations, so to speak. So I guess to clarify, are you against something like universal basic income, period? Like, are you against doing it? Or is it merely that you want to make sure that we understand that it's not structurally changing the problems of the system?
It's mostly the latter. I don't oppose doing these things any more than I oppose, giving welfare to people who are denied a job. But because the liberal part of American politics has long ago given up the critique of the structure, the notion of basic change, the whole debate of the 20th century about capitalism versus socialism, which, by the way, is coming back now. But because the liberals gave up on it, people like me have to hammer at the inadequacy of these band-aids, lest the idea be that we either have no band-aid or we have a band-aid, but that something beyond the band-aid is somehow unthinkable or undiscussable. So I want to point out that, for example, if you give everybody a guaranteed basic income, but some people go to work and have a job and earn way more than all of that, you're just inviting what our own history shows us, which is sooner or later the people who work for an living will be, how shall I put it politely, helped to see the people who get the guaranteed income as, in some sense, living off the taxes they pay. And therefore, the tension between the employed and the unemployed that has always dogged capitalism will simply resurface in an adjusted form around the question of a basic income. Therefore, I would much rather face the reality, which is, if we have technological change that makes it possible for fewer people to be more productive than they used to be, so that instead of needing 100 workers to make something, we only need 50. We can cut the labor cost in half. Capitalism solves that problem in a particular way. It fires half the people.
Right.
Why? Because then you can produce the same amount with half the people, sell it, let's presume for simplicity, at the same price. And what you get as revenue, you now don't have to pay half the workers you used to. You keep that money as your profit, which is why the technological change attracts you in the first place. But that's the capitalist answer, but it oughtn't to be ours. Why? Because the alternative way of handling a doubling in productivity, which is what we've just discussed, would be to give everybody half the amount of hours per day to work. That way, everybody keeps their job, everybody keeps their income. What the benefit of technology is what we really always promised people, namely leisure. And in a society not driven by profit, that the technology would be advanced because the gain is to the majority in more leisure rather than the gain to a minority in the way of more profit. These are the questions that are structural and basic, and these are the ones that still remain a bit too scary for virtually all of the candidates in the Democratic Party to get a hold of.
Yeah, I actually did a commentary yesterday about the latest jobs numbers, and I said it's fine to talk about 75,000 versus the expected number. It's fine to talk about 0.2% wage growth versus 0.5, but fundamentally, none of this stuff is actually addressing these incoming and growing issues of the relationship of humans to work. And my analysis of the 100 employees versus 50 due to the technological change has been, and I wonder if you agree with it, that the pure free market capitalist reception of that technological change that allows you to double productivity would be you fire half the workers. And that's also bad for other elements of the economy, because now you have 50 workers that no longer have money with which to buy things from other businesses. The pure socialist solution might be, well, we've socialized ownership of the company to begin with, so the workers share in all the gains. Now, here's where I wonder if we disagree. The social democracy solution might be the business owners are entitled to some piece of that productivity gain, whereas some significant portion would be divided up by the workers. Is that fair? Is that pie in the sky?
No, I think that's a perfectly reasonable step. I mean, it assumes something, namely that the owners are in some sense different from the people who are working there.
Yes.
If you really change the system, that difference would disappear. But let's keep it for a while. Let's assume that there are owners or capitalists on the one hand and workers on the other. It would be an enormous step forward. I would agree, to have a discussion in which the question is raised, okay, we now have a technical advance. We can install that here in the business we have. And that gives us what? It gives us a choice. We can either use all of it for profit and fire half the workers, or we can use none of it for profit and give all the workers basically a half-time employment situation at the same wage. Or, and this is simple arithmetic, we can split the difference. We can have a conversation, a discussion, maybe a vote as to what portion of the gains from a technological advance are given to workers in the form of leisure versus employers in the form of profits. That already would be a level of the democratization of the workplace, which is what I stress anyway, would be a major step forward. And by the way, while this is a revolutionary idea here in the United States,
right,
social democracies in Europe, this is not a new idea. This is, in fact, what goes on in Germany and France and Italy. Unions often are bargaining with employers on precisely how to divide technical and other kinds of advances in terms of sharing, in a sense, in the benefits. It's not revolutionary. It's not challenging the private ownership of the industries and the empire and the enterprises, but it is saying that what happens with an advance of technology is something that has to be discussed and worked out like everything else about the workplace, and not something simply to be determined to the advantage of one side and the exclusion of participation on the other.
Well, that gets me to something else I want to hear your thoughts on, which is that there's a very specific and productive, I think, debate to be had about capitalism versus socialism, social democracy versus unregulated capitalism, et cetera. But are you concerned about what I have seen as sort of some confusion between social democracy and socialism? I've done a number of segments where I'm saying, if we even really want to seriously have this debate, we have to make sure that we're calling things what they are. And socialism, where the means of production is socialized, is different than something like the Swedish system or the Danish system, which is a capitalist system that says we are going to use more of the government revenue to ensure that the standard of living doesn't go below a certain level. Is that an academic distinction, or is that a serious distinction that we need to understand to really talk about this stuff?
I could not be more 100% the latter and not the former. In other words, this is not academic or abstract or nitpicking or anything like that. This is of the essence. And that's part of our backwardness here in the United States. For a half a century after the end of World War II, socialism, communism, Marxism, all of that was proscribed. It was declared traitorous. It was declared evil. It was whatever you want. And people were good Americans who kept away from it, didn't think about it, didn't read about it, didn't debate about it, nothing. And now that capitalism has shown itself to need basic change to an awful lot of people for whom it isn't working real well, there's a process of rediscovery. And that's all to the good. But in that process, you are right, the confusion and the misuse of language and the naming of things that really oughtn't to be named that way, because 100 years of literature and debate have clarified these differences, but Americans are just learning. Let me give you an example. 2 weeks ago, I was invited, and I did it, to be on the town hall of the Fox television system for an hour.
Yes.
Answering questions from a live audience, debating, by the way, Lou Dobbs and Neil Cavuto and all of those people. Sitting next to me, Herman Cain, the candidate for president, so that we had a debate. It was capitalism versus socialism. And there on display was this arresting fudge of words and ideas in which the same word, socialism, was applied to Sweden, to Italy, to China, to Russia, to Venezuela. I mean, the chaos and confusion that is being sown Now, partly on the other side, they want to lump all of these things together.
Right.
I understand that. But if you're interested in these things as real options for a society in difficulty, which I am and many Americans are, that has to be clarified. And I think it's very good, even if it's difficult, that you begin to say, look, this is social democracy, or this is democratic socialism. This is something else to which we can give a variety of names that have been used. But we have to begin clarifying this so we can have the conversation and the political action focused on what it is we actually want.
Well, that's good. It makes me feel better that I haven't been wasting my time with those segments. We've been speaking with economist Richard Wolff. The new book is called Understanding Marxism. It's available everywhere you would imagine books are available. Professor Wolff, always great to talk to you.
Great to talk to you, David, and hope we can do it again soon.